All right. Morning, or I guess afternoon, everyone. It's SAEM. I've been inside closed doors, so the transition from morning to afternoon hasn't quite happened yet until I actually see the outside world. But welcome. So this is If I Know Now, if I knew then what I know now, lessons learned in research. And the intention of today's talk is a couplefold. So one, it is, as we say there, to help us learn from our mistakes, from things we've done that we wish we'd known, right? There's a second door. Let's go. We work in the ED. We got this. We're used to loud noises. So, all right. The intention right now is to learn from some of our errors going through this process. And we actually scoped this out in advance to kind of create a little bit of a story, starting from ideas all the way to execution and share different lessons learned throughout that process. And that's one part, okay? The second part is to just approach this from the humility that we all make mistakes. Nobody's perfect. No matter how many publications you have, I will tell you, my CV of failures exceeds my CV list of successful publications by like 2, 3, 4-fold. We all make mistakes. We all learn from that. It's a good thing. We should be learning from these things. And that's part of what we're hoping to do today. Now, the way we're running this, we have cases and examples, and we're going to talk about some of our personal lessons learned. But what I want from you all is to be engaged and ask us questions. After each case, ask us, give us feedback, give us your insights, your experiences that may, if it resonates with you. Ask questions throughout this. This is meant to be a close-knit community. We're opening ourselves up saying, here are the things we've failed at. So that means that you have free reign. Talk comfortably. This is the safest environment because we're all here to learn together. All right? All right, with that, let me introduce our amazing panel. I'll start with myself since I have the microphone in my hand. I'm Mike Gottlieb. I run the ultrasound division at Rush in Chicago. And I have failed so many times that I don't think I could actually run a list of that anymore. But I've learned from every single one of them. And I am a better researcher because every single time I fail, I reflect back on it. And I'm hoping that you all learn from that too.
Hi there, my name is Sam Lam. I'm also the ultrasound director at Southern Medical Center in Sacramento, California. I'm a constant student, and I'll let you know my story, but basically I'm also like a magnet for failure, and I would walk you through my journey through research with my stories.
So my name is Peter Ho. I'm actually a nocturnist in the ED and a daytime intensivist at Brigham and Women's Hospital. My topic of interest are research in sepsis ARDS and the sort of transitions from ED ICU.
Hi, my name is Yanina Puram-Shamto. I'm a Vice Chair of Faculty Development and Research at Rush University, and I have Masters in Clinical Research, and I can't even tell you how many grants I wrote that never got funded. So I am truly glad that I'm here and sharing this journey.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jamie Jordan. I'm one of the Associate Program Directors at UCLA and Director of our Discovery Year in our third year of medical school, which is our scholarly year. And I'm an education researcher, and I have, failed miserably at so many things, and we're very happy to share our stories today.
So I thought it would be fair that I lead us off. This is a project I started as I was a resident. It was my PGY2 EM residency year. I had this idea. I thought it was brilliant. We see a lot of people with distal radius fractures. And we do these reductions, and they're in horrible pain. And we know that these blind hematoma blocks aren't that good. They're okay. They're not great. So I said, how about ultrasound-guided hematoma blocks? It made sense. It's like, I can see where I'm going. I know that ultrasound makes all things better. No bias, but it does. And so ultrasound, I was like, this is great. So I did, a trial run. I blocked the radius, I blocked the ulnar styloid, I had a pain-free reduction. I was like, this is amazing. I wrote a case report, and I was like, no one's even done a case report of this? This is a shoo-in, right? Seemed great. So I gathered my resources, found a project mentor who helped mentor me kind of through the design of it, and I launched the study. I was going to do a randomized controlled trial of ultrasound versus blind hematoma block and distal radius fractures in the ED, and I was going to run it all on my own. And I was like, yes, this is definitely going to work. And so 3, 4, 5 months in, I had 6 patients. I was aiming for 50. 6 patients. And that was like the peak. That was like in the middle of winter when people are falling and my numbers were high. And I was like, I'm here all the time. I have like no patients enrolled. Man, what went wrong? And so that was the time I learned about FINER. And some of you may be familiar with it, some of you may not be. FINER is an acronym for for a model to say is a study good. It stands for feasible, interesting, novel, ethical, relevant. So feasible, is it something we can actually do? Now, if I'm one person trying to enroll all these people for this, and I'm also a resident working clinically, and there's no one else that's enrolling people, well, that's probably not feasible. But I didn't run this list. Is it interesting? Yeah, that was the problem. The I, it was like a capital I right in the center. Feasible kind of fell to the wayside. I was like, it's interesting to me, and that's all that matters. I didn't gut check myself on the project. Is it novel? I passed novel. There wasn't a lot on this. Is it ethical? Yeah. If I could reduce pain for people, absolutely. Is it relevant? Yeah. We see distal radius fractures. They need pain control. We should be better at this. It passed those, but the problem is I missed the F. I went right to the EINER, and I was really excited about the capital I. And whether or not you're familiar with this, I will say that even now, I have to gut check myself when I get really excited about projects to be like, wait a second, Mike, run your algorithm. Is it feasible? Can you actually do this? You may want to do this, but can you do this? And to be honest, for some of my bigger studies, I ask someone else. I phone a friend. I've done, I don't know, a couple hundred research studies, and I still phone a friend. If I'm like, I'm not on the fence about this, tell me, what do you think about this? Is this interesting, right? Is this something that is interesting to me? And then is this relevant? Is it interesting to anyone else? If it's just interesting to me, well, that's great. I can publish on my own blog, and no one else will want to read it because it's interesting to me and no one else, right? Running it through this algorithm, having some system, whether you use FINER, whether you use something else, if you're not gut checking your ideas and getting a second set of opinions, inevitably you're going to spend a lot of time on something that may not be feasible or may not be relevant to anyone else. So that was my big lesson learned here, is find a system to check your ideas, phone a friend, make sure it's something you can actually do.
All right. Hello, everyone. Once again, my name is Sam Lam, and I'm going to do something a little ambitious here. I'm going to walk you through my journey through research. I'm going to walk you through how I got deeper and deeper involved in research from the snapshots in various stages of my career. So the first time I thought I was really interested in research was when I was a pediatric emergency medicine fellow. So that was probably like 15 plus years ago. And the project that I was doing at that time was a project called single agent versus alternating antipyretics for pediatric fever. And I was obviously young and naive at that time, and I decided to just, go big or go home. So what happened? I tried to do a randomized control trial on, right? See, you guys listen to Mike, and that's probably not meeting the FINER criteria, but I didn't know that at that time. So that's the project that I chose. And we knew that it wasn't going to be like a lot of kids with fever in the pediatric emergency department. So what we did was that we wanted to recruit the pediatric inpatient subjects as well as part of a study. And heading up the project was myself and my PEM chief, who did not have any formal research training, but had great working knowledge. He was a great personality, a tremendous mentor, very approachable. And we put together a detailed protocol, calculated a sample size, and just went ahead and do a project. So what happened? It was an epic failure, right? You guessed it. So why was that? We had our logistic challenges. I mean, everybody had their logistic challenges. We had logistic challenges, including the fact that the nurses on the floor actually did not want to take rectal temperature on the kids because they thought it was invasive. I wasn't expecting that. Many of the kids admitted to the floor actually did not have fever long enough to merit alternating antipyretics. We did not expect that. But the reason we failed, the main reason that we failed was actually similar to Mike's story, was basically we had inadequate recruitment of our subjects. So what would I do? What would I have done if I would do it all over again? I'd probably spend a lot more time upfront. And that's one of the key lessons. Spend more time upfront learning, planning your study. And I would have got a lot more help. I would have assembled a lot bigger team than what I had at the time. So what kind of people, what kind of team members do I want to get? I want to get a methodologist. That's probably one of the key members. A methodologist would tell me if my study design is sound, if my study makes sense, if it's going to pass the eye of a critic. I would have asked for a trained statistician, not because we didn't know how to calculate a sample size, but also to come up with like an alternating plan if we were to fail our recruitment standard and come up with something else that we can come out with instead of just like failing the whole project together. I would have asked for the help of my peers, which at the time were pediatric emergency medicine fellows, we had pediatric residents, and we had emergency medicine residents as well. I would have made them co-investigators. I was a little, I think I was a little too selfish. I was like, yeah, I could do it. But I would have made them all co-investigators for me to help me recruit all these subjects. I would have gotten the help of my colleagues. I ran my projects by a couple of people, and I think I would have just fleshed it out with a lot more people and make sure all the practical details, including people on the floor, people on the, on the administration side and the emergency department, make sure all the details are not missed. And it would have been nice to have a research assistant, a few research assistants to help me as well with my projects. And they're also like sort of invisible members of the team, but they're key to the team as well, including your department chair, your research director, whose approval you need to move the project forward. And very importantly, you have to have a very understanding and patient family to allow you to do things that you want to do. And my wife is not here today, but she's been putting up with me in a lot of ways throughout my career. So here's the teaching point. Here's the lesson learned. Just like anything else in medicine, you need a great team to be successful in doing a research project. And you want to get help early, and don't be afraid to ask for help, because you're gonna need a lot of it. Despite, no matter how small your project is, no matter how trivial you think your project is, you're gonna have a good team, and that's gonna ensure that you have a successful research project. Thank you.
Before I kind of pass along, as we're going through it, at any point, raise your hand if you have questions, if things resonate with you. Yes, I love this. Go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm an early career faculty transitioning to mid-career, and I have several projects at the same time. So that's actually the question I came with today, is building your team, your research team, especially when you have multiple ongoing. Specifically on a project coordinator, I would love to hear how you all have recruited project coordinators, what you look for. Thank you.
Excellent question.
Yeah, project coordinators are tough. I think the best way to do it, and actually I've progressed to the point that I'm doing multi-institutional study, with the paperwork just totally multiplies. And the best way to do it is to get institutional grant, because they're fairly easy to get, and then just use that grant to pay for like a research coordinator. They don't have to have a lot of training. They just have to know how to take care of the paperwork. So there are various mechanisms you can do it, and that's sort of my advice. You just get a small grant, like a few $1,000s, and just pay somebody part-time to take care of the paperwork. It just saves you a lot of time and just agony. I don't know if you have anything else.
So thank you. And my story to share, everyone, is really, this is a graph of a clinical trial over time enrollment. And it's, spans 5 years from 2008 to 2012. It's a figure from the manuscript. And really the story here about knowing the time requirements. Remember, time equals money, okay? So the story is that I was hired in 2005. My ED research director then in 2006, there is an impactful research trial in sepsis that's being proposed. 2007, the protocol was being finalized, funding being begun, and we were actually being considered as one of the study sites. However, we were not chosen as one of the first-tier study sites. But that's okay, it was already a good experience to get involved as a junior, investigator in my first trial, pretty much. 2008, the trial investigators, with a sample size of over 1,900 over 5 years, knew that a dozen sites or more in the teams are just not enough. So they actually recruited more sites, and we were reconsidered, and then we kind of got in and activated in August of 2008. We enroll our first patient in 2000 in September next month, and over 5 years, we actually enroll 99 participants. So but before going that, is that even before you have to think about, well, our site, I had to go to my department chair, my ED research director, like, the capitation didn't look too favorable, right? Because it was a per enrollment capitation type of reimbursement to these sites. But my ED research system back then is like, you know what? This is going to be such an impactful trial. I'll just go for it. You really got nothing to lose, and we will support you. The ED research director knew that, and also knew the financial potential, I would say, risk. But everyone was really on board because our site was being represented, right? It's one of those non-financial value to the department. And also, we're participating in really science and potentially transformation change. So, as I mentioned, we enroll well, and at times it was really 24/7 kind of work. I was pretty much on call. Besides the trial, one memorable really event that happened during the trial, kind of want to mention, was actually the birth of my second daughter in Easter Sunday 2012. Guess what I was doing? Enrolling a patient in the ED as they were upstairs. So, but that's how the commitment, expectations needed, and also there were some also incentives, of course, and all that. It was a great opportunity to learn from really international experts in sepsis, and in a way you get mentored that way. You think about it, right? And how but you have to sort of think about your own site and your own infrastructure implementation. However, the study ended in 2013, published, a landmark article in 2014. In 2015, our ED research and also leadership, more the leadership changed. And my ED research director, who knew about the financial risk, came back in 2015. And basically, interestingly, it was a conversation. And by the way, we look back a little bit on the financials, and you actually owe $50,000. So I went to the new ED research leadership, and it's like, well, you know what? I wasn't involved in that initial discussion, so please just, solve it on your own. And then my division chief was like, you know what? This is just ridiculous, right? It's like the trials ended. It ended and published. Everything's actually done, So really, we sat down at dinner, and guess what I was told? Peter, work harder. Yeah. So the lessons learned here, always get it in writing, even for your leadership. Thank you.
How do you make that calculation when you're, obviously this seems like this was a network, like RCT. How do you make that calculation of capitation per patient enrollment, or is it a bundle per site? Is it worth your time? Is there any other stuff?
Well, it depends on where you are in your career development, right? As a junior faculty, this was a great opportunity. I had verbal support, I guess, from my ED leadership. But the capitation, unfortunately, from the trial, oftentimes these are federal government, it's not negotiable. So then you have to look at your own site, how you make it work, or not financially. Because oftentimes, sites do have to subsidize federal trials. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yeah.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
Maybe make a comment about that as chair. Most of the time research is sitting around waiting for patients.
you can't hire somebody for 0.25, especially nowadays. You can't hire a reporter. So the secret is you have to work, and sometimes it's different studies completely, but you train your staff on multiple studies, and that's like a key threshold where you go from, I can't make this work, I can't make this work, until, oh, okay, this is going to work. You know, you gotta get good at math.
Yeah.
You really have to figure out how many I'm going to enroll, like not how
Well,
many I want to enroll, but how many I'm going to enroll.
it's projections and the best you can with the numbers you have. And in addition to what you said is that you definitely want other trials that have higher reimbursement rate, right? Capitation, oftentimes from industry. So that's another way to mix and match. Yeah. Thank you.
All right. So my lesson, as I mentioned in the introduction, after writing HRQ grants, some other NIH grants, and being a completely novel researcher, I wasn't funded. So I decided I'll go a different route. I'm going to partner as a co-PI with somebody who is already NIH-funded and has a success rate of 100%. And so I was asked to participate as a co-PI in one of the investigations with Behavioral Sciences Department. A very interesting trial looking at urban women ages 18 or 40 who present to emergency department with acute pain and what factors in their history predispose them from developing chronic pain syndromes. So primarily looking at trauma, psychological, physical, etc. So a very, very novel trial. It is a 5-year longitudinal study. We looked at their pain tolerance. We looked at other interventions, looked at lots of surveys, substance use disorders, etc. And that trial was supposed to cover me at 10%. So 10% of my time is 10% of my time. Now, NIH, on the other hand, has a different perspective what is paying for 10% of your time. And what it typically pays is at the cap, NIH cap. Everybody knows. And caps are floating, and 1 year it's like 185, 189. And so from year to year, those caps actually vary too. So when you're applying for budget, you have to take that into account. And NIH typically does announce that next year the NIH cap will be different. Your salary is typically not $184,000 as an emergencologist. And so your salary, as you can see, is probably, and this is a random number, this is not my example, specifically for my salary, but it is probably much higher than what the cap is. And so 10% at your salary equates to about 7.6% of the NIH cap salary, right? So there is that gap. And the gap usually 3 to 4% depending what your salary is. And so looking at that gap, you need to say, well, who is going to pay that gap? Because NIH, when it comes to audit you, you have to show 10% you have FTE that was dedicated to the clinical trial. And so when you do that, you can ask your department, of course, your chair, to cost share that negotiate that gap. You can go to the primary recipient of that grant to say, well, will you be able to pay the difference to my department to reimburse for that gap? And if not, what's going to happen? So actually, if we audit this grant, on the papers, it looked like I did 10%. In reality, the reimbursement was 6%. So from the budgetary standpoint, nobody cost shared. I just ended up working a little bit more and covered my salary with the clinical work, which is not supposed to happen. And actually, the lesson learned is don't do it, because if you get audited, it's fraud, really. And so the next year, when we realized that happened, we went back to the department that did negotiate, actually, that cost share. So they did cover, the behavioral sciences department ended up covering that 3 to 4% difference on the grant that wasn't paid by the funding from NIH. So the lesson learned is NIH time, funded time, is not your funded time, and just make sure that you know all that when you're applying and when you're budgeting. There's many different nuances, and all of the academic institutions typically have these workbooks that you can plug in the numbers and play with them to know what exactly the funding will be, what your direct cost will be, what your indirect cost will be, which is also negotiated from the institution to the federal government, and also is a floating number and changes. And I just recently learned that even though there are negotiated rates, there are different rates that you can go to institution and ask for. If there are special circumstances, they will allow you to do some differences in the indirect costs, et cetera. And these numbers are not the same if you're applying for NIH funding versus you're applying for philanthropic funding. And so you need to know at your institution what those rates are for all of the above. Your directs, your indirects, your de minimis rates, et cetera. So make sure you know how the budget is working and negotiate that upfront before you submit the budgets. Thank you. You guys have any questions?
All right, so my story is titled Throwing Good Money After a Losing Hand, and oddly enough, I'm actually going to Vegas after this conference, so this is very fitting. But it starts out that one of my friends approached me with a project idea, and he's like, hey, do you want to be a collaborator? I was like, sure, the topic was really interesting, this is a good friend of mine. Yeah, why not? I didn't ask any questions, I just said yes. All right, fast forward a little while later, he's like, okay, we kind of roughly talked about some idea, but we really didn't talk about any of the details. And at this point now, he says, all right, I got the data collection, everything is done. I'm going to give you some brief overview of the results, and all you need to do is write the discussion. And I'm like, okay, cool. What's the deadline? Okay, 2 weeks. Okay, no problem. So I get the discussion done. Meanwhile, there's not any introduction done. There's not any literature search done. There's nothing really to work with aside from these summary results, which are very much summaries. But again, that didn't raise any red flags at the time. I was just like, okay, I got to get the discussion done. I'm going to get the discussion done. So I write the discussion, I meet my deadline, and then I wait. And I'm like, okay, hey, you know, what's happening? What's going on next? And I look at the Google Doc draft of the manuscript, and the only thing in there is my discussion. I'm like, okay, we making progress? And then my friend comes back to me, he's like, well, we've hit a little roadblock. We don't have IRB approval. Now, it's not as bad as the whole big gas. The data that we had was just part of normal educational activities, so we didn't do anything really unethical. But yes, a little bit shocking that this is the point that we're now talking about this. And I'm like, okay, what's the problem? Well, it's not, I'm having some troubles with my IRB. Okay, well, let me see if I can troubleshoot this issue. My IRB is pretty friendly to education research. I'll write up the protocol, I'll submit it through my IRB. Okay, so I do that. It's deemed exempt. We move forward. Okay, so that issue is solved. Now we just need to do the writing, right? Gonna get the rest of the writing done? Okay, give me some time and I got it. All right, so I wait a little bit more. And I keep checking the Google Doc to see if anything else has been inputted, and nothing yet. And so I go back to my friend and I say, hey, you know, what needs to happen that we can just, you know, finish this and get it off our plates? Well, you know, the other folks really haven't been able to find the time to get their sections done. I'm like, okay, so you're just telling me we just need more writing. I can do more writing. So I do more writing, and I write up the introduction, and I'm like, all you need to do now is put in the methods and the results, because that I was not a part of and I cannot do. And then I sit and I wait, and I wait a little bit more, and then my friend comes back to me and they say, well, there's a little problem with the data. I'm like, okay, what's the problem? Well, we don't have access to the raw data anymore. And I, at this point, I'm just dumbfounded, right? So, of course, needless to say, without the raw data, we couldn't finish the manuscript. It never got published. And I spent a lot of time and energy after something that was doomed to fail from the very beginning. So, my lessons learned. First, well, there were probably a lot of lessons to be learned, but I think one of the first things was trust but verify, even with your friends. I could have saved myself a lot of time, heartache, and energy if I would have just asked a few very basic questions right from the beginning. I think the other big lesson is this one, is just know when it's time to throw in the towel. So I think there is a time when you can overcome some hurdles with a little bit of elbow grease, and the time when you just need to say, no, this is not salvageable. And the problem for me is with each little injection that I put in of my own time and energy, I became more and more invested in this project that was doomed to failure. So I think it is really something to be learned, is have that willpower that when you see the writing on the wall, just walk away. Thank you.
You said
Okay, first clarify the research question, then clarify the study design and the protocol and make sure those two things align, and then get an estimation of what steps actually need to be involved to successfully complete the study and what the estimated time frame is. And I think, again, very simple, common sense things that if I would have asked those instead of just blindly trusting, I would have saved myself a lot of heartache.
All right, I got a question for you. You used a lot of past tense there. Are you still friends with that person?
I actually am still friends with this person. We have collaborated on other things, but I ask questions now.
All right, so we are at the roughly midpoint. Oh, thank you.
Sorry, I thought your summary was going to be they published it, and you found it published some months later, and with all your work. So actually, I had a question about that though, on plagiarism. If you, maybe just you, or if specifically the women I want to hear from, honestly, if you've had experiences with that and how you dealt with that, as someone who's unfortunately been sort of, I guess, victim to that maybe 2 or 3 times, and I've always sort of been told like, suck it up, you know, don't like ruffle, whatever, or if someone else has another.
Response or? Oh, question.
I haven't had a personal experience with plagiarism. I have had an idea that I had come up with and shared with somebody, taken and then presented at a national meeting without incorporating myself. And that was I felt very hurt by that. And what I just did is I just came and asked that person. I had a relationship with that person. And so I felt comfortable just going directly to them and being like, hey, that wasn't cool. And we had a nice long talk and talking about ways to remedy the situation going forward. But that's the only story that I could share to that effect.
So I don't have a plagiarism per se, but a very interesting in the similar category story where, as a resident, I wrote up a chapter for trauma to publish in procedure book. And then a specialist in that area actually was the author, and I was put on as an editor. And as a resident at that point, you don't question, great, your name is an editor on a publication 25 years ago. That was awesome, so thank you. So when I was applying for a master's in clinical research, I was interviewing with a chair of preventive medicine who looked that up and says, oh, you listed as an editor in this chapter. And she says, well, what did you do for that? And I said, well, I wrote it up, gave it to the author and who's listed, and he said, oh, that's great, and submitted it under his name. And then she takes a Webster dictionary and opens the page under editor and reads the definition to me. And then she says, don't ever do it again. And then I was accepted into master's program.
Actually, the question will be somewhat indirectly addressed in my second story.
And before, I noted, and coming to in about 10 seconds, but as we're at the halfway point, we actually have a couple different pathways we can go down with this. We have a second round of stories, which that may come up, but if people have questions, we can just keep it as more of an open Q&A and discuss through things, which I think is a little more engaging. So we have a backup option, but I'm going to let the questions run as long as they run, and then we can kind of, add in cases at the end of that, because I think that's part of the fun of this, right, is to actually be a part of this all here and ask questions. With that noted then, I'm going to pass back if you do want to talk about that for your case. And then I was going to say if you wanted to respond back with that, or else I can pass the next question.
If you want to talk about your story. Oh, you want me to? I can talk about
And just like if you wanted the abridged, or else we can come back to it.
Yeah, let her
Okay.
question first.
Hello. So I'm very early in my research career, which is odd to even say as a word. And my focus is more medical education, and I think I'm probably going to end up more being a qualitative researcher. But I kind of noticed an interesting theme in that recruitment was kind of an issue in a lot of the first 3 stories. And so the first project I'm working on, I'm having a lot of trouble recruiting residents for qualitative interviews. And what I kind of wanted to kind of hear from you guys about in your research experience is maybe a little bit of recruitment, and then I also had a specific question about research about recruitment. When I looked into this, there's actually really basically no data about recruiting. I was only looking in the resident and medical student kind of environment in qual, but there's pretty much no data on recruiting residents, recruiting med students for studies, which makes sense, right? Like you're not going to report. How do you quantify the people who aren't there, and how do you talk about that? But I don't know if there's been any conversation about that. Like the idea that I had is actually interviewing the researchers about their experiences about it. So I just wanted to hear from you guys.
Yeah, so I do a fair amount of qualitative research. And I will say getting residents to participate is a little bit of a challenge just because they're busy and they have a lot of other competing demands. So I found what works for me is, one, doing a really good job in a succinct period of time about why this matters and why, specifically hitting out why it matters to them, not just why it matters to you or society. Think about like why they can find the importance in it. And then making the interviews, or if it's interviews or focus groups or however you decide to collect your data, making it as convenient as possible. So either doing a video interview over Zoom rather than, if you don't feel like you're going to lose too much in the data collection versus an in-person, letting them be able to schedule it at any hour that is convenient for them, regardless of how convenient it is for you. Sometimes those things help. I don't know that we're going to get into maybe the pros and cons of incentives, but that might be something, again, nominal to consider. If you provide them food, make it a comfortable environment, something that they can do with their friends, that seems to help with recruitment as well. In terms of the research on recruitment, I'd be really interested to tell you what you find.
So I actually have much more experience and success with medical students, and specifically those who are interested in emergency medicine. So offering a research elective with you helps quite a bit because it's a dedicated 2-week, 4-week, depending on how you structure it, time with a specific project that you would put on them. There are lots of dean's fellowships that are funded usually in medical schools for students over the summertime, and they pay students for 4 or 8 weeks, depending what the time commitment is. And that's a really great way to also fund them to do a research project. And also recruiting from the interest group to come in and say, you know what, I will expect 10 hours a week, 8 hours a week, whatever it is, and you have to give me a schedule, and they have to have an accountability to their time commitment. So those are the only way for it to be successful from the time standpoint.
I think some of this, then we'll get to yours right after that. I think some of this too will depend a little bit on the type of research, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, but ultimately it's the feasibility, right? If I want to do a study on for example, what is residents' experience driving home after night shifts, and all my residents live near the hospital, I'm not going to have anyone that can sample. So that's probably not going to work feasibly, right? But there might be a nearby institution I can borrow from, and I can reach out to their residents and maybe get a site champion at that place. So it might be just reaching beyond your institution. Some of it is, as Dr. Jordan mentioned it's a concept of what's in for me. What's the value for them? It might be a theoretical, by knowing this, we can now improve your night shift regimen. We can make shifts better for you. We can make shifts driving safer to better understand this, right? That's a value add. It might be we can give you X amount of money, and that's great, or we will buy you food and Starbucks and coffee and things. Sometimes it's a matter of, particularly as Dr. Permsham-Tubbs mentioned, for like students, maybe it's just learning something. Like oftentimes what I'll do for some of the qualitative work that I do is after the session's done, we'll debrief and I'll teach some qualitative work, and now you get to learn a new research method. That's the trade-off, is that not only is it, again, here's your value to like the bigger society and to the program, but like also, now we're going to learn this, right? I'm going to teach you why I did things like this. I'm going to teach you about member checking and why I asked these questions this way. And you get to learn this cool new thing. And now that you've learned it, maybe next project you can join this and be the interview because you've been on both sides of that and you've seen it now, right? So figure out what the value is to them and connect it to them. I will put a last plug in here is that you only have so much social capital. And so we have to be conscious of that. Every time we ask someone to do something, we do expend a little bit of their social capital. If we ask the same people over and over again to do surveys every week, then the 10th survey becomes harder and the 30th survey becomes harder. So you have to figure out what things you want to expend your social capital on and what you're going to do to build that back up.
So it's what motivates people, right? So I read somewhere there's either money, power, or sex. So unfortunately, we cannot give any of those to these people. So here's what I usually do. What I usually do is I offer the resident, I'm at that point that I don't really care as much about the abstract. So I usually just give the abstract to the resident, and I say, you know what, if you do well, you got to present abstract. There's usually more than one conference you can submit to. If you really want to present your abstract, just present another conference and have their residents sort of like had the ownership and have them find other people to help them out with their peer. Usually I find it very effective. Like they would just motivate other residents. So they just like, they have their way of talking other people into doing it with them. So to me, that has been a very successful model of recruiting residents and trainees.
Any other question?
So the abstract gets done, so what happens to the paper?
Yeah, I mean, usually what happens is it's a good question. So, the residents usually focus on the short term, right? So, what happened is that, you would get the abstract out by the end of residency, and that's a requirement for them to graduate, and that's what they really care about. If they really put in a substantial amount of work, sure, they can be on the paper. That's not a problem. I don't promise them authorship on a paper easily, but because of that, I think it takes much longer time. The reward is a lot further away, and there's some strict guidelines. So I would give them authorship if they contribute enough, but I don't easily promise it up front.
Thank you. Question about projects or study ideas that progress along over time and then change, and as a junior investigator, how to decline a study idea without damaging that relationship if it's kind of no longer what you initially agreed to.
I can take a first stab at that. So I think we absolutely need to be more comfortable saying no at the first place. I think that if we overextend ourselves, we do too many things. We won't have time for ourselves. We won't have time for projects we are actually passionate about. But I think that any no should generally be followed by a but or and. No, but let me introduce you to this person who's great at this study. I have someone who would be great for this project, right? Open that door. If it's not a great fit for you or you don't have the capacity for it, open that door for someone else. And if it is a great fit for you and it's a better fit for someone else, still open the door for someone else. It doesn't need to all be on our shoulders to do every single project. Be comfortable with offering the opportunity, and it should be like in our response to think about it when we're saying no. Who will benefit from this, right? Not who are going to turf something no one wants to do, but like who will actually benefit from this opportunity. It's like align with them, giving them an opportunity to grow. So who can we sponsor up? I very much try to have that like built into my response anytime I say no.
So I totally agree with Jamie's point, but the other ways of doing it, there's typically discretionary funds that you can ask, and your chair may have that. They may have, the dean may have it. Your faculty affairs and provost may have it. And so if this is a research that is impactful and definitely will give institutional recognition, results, et cetera, and publishable data, I think there's ways to fund it through those outside resources. Also, it's interestingly, so if the department is doing philanthropic research, frequently those funds are not restricted. And so if there's accumulation of funds through enrolling patients, let's say through pharmaceutical grants, et cetera, and then there is accumulation of that funds, you can ask to see if those funds could be allocated for your pilot studies.
So I agree, yeah. It is a upfront negotiation with your sort of leadership and also research director. I think everyone has their own different models, I would say, in their ED. Our ED research is really in a way, we have to utilize our ED research group for clinical research, that recruiting patients in the ED and all that. So we're obligated to do that. And a lot of us felt that, well, we have our own grant, our kind of pot of money, our trial. Why can't we hire our own research coordinator and have sort of oversight over that as well? So at least there are different ways of doing it, whether you're collaborating with the institution, right? You sort of can, in a way, make some agreements where you can offload some of the funding stream to different ways. And also, you can also get your own grant funding, in a way, efforts and money to your buy-down time as well from other departments, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I feel like it's hard, right? So to me, it seems like the amount, even if you negotiate some protected time, the amount of time you're going to put into it is going to exceed that protected time. And even if you negotiate 0.1, 0.2, it really doesn't matter. But the way I've done it, it's really negotiate my admin duties and my teaching duties. So you'd be amazed, like if you don't have to go to meetings, if you don't have to teach a lot of things that's not relevant to you, that actually saves you a lot of time. And that's actually how I got my work done. It's just like I got minimal administrative duties and teaching obligations, and they gave me a lot of protected time, so to speak, right? I don't like those are invisible times, but that's what everybody has. And if you get rid of that, that gives you a little bit of time.
I think ultimately kind of tying it back to some of the other discussions too is figure out what matters to them. Is your chair looking to increase funding or get that back? What's the return on investment? What's the ROI? Is it we want to build a research infrastructure? Understanding the cost involved in that. What is the value to that person? And then match it to it and pitch it in words that they understand, right? I can talk all I want about how ultrasound is the most amazing thing in the world, but that's probably not going to matter as much as here's the value to what matters to you, right? Connected to what matters to them. With that, I think we're at our time. First of all, thank you all for your amazing questions, for being a part of this, and to our amazing panelists for sharing their experience, their insights, their lessons learned. It's always really hard to share. It's easier to share the wins than the failures, but thank you all for sharing your failures and the things you've grown from them and how you've led such amazing careers as a result of them.